We're diving deep today into a topic that often seems like, well, frankly, a contradiction. The ancient laws of war.
Right.
When we think of Greek and Roman conflicts, we picture sieges, wholesale enslavement, utter battlefield brutality.
And let's be honest, that chaos was often the reality. It truly was.
But if we just leave it at that, just assume ancient conflicts were purely chaotic.
We miss something really crucial, don't we? A whole sociological and legal development. Because even amidst that brutality, these societies, they recognized and often fiercely guarded let's say, a nascent set of customs, religious taboos, ethical boundaries, all designed to impose some kind of order.
Okay, so not codified international treaties like we have today.
No, not in that sense. These were rules rooted much more in, well, religion, honor, shared identity, particularly for the Greeks, that Hellenic identity. They represent the earliest attempts to place morality and limits on state-sanctioned violence.
And this is exactly what our source material lets us unpack today. Our mission, really, is to explore these specific customs, the rituals, the legal precedents that governed, well, every phase of conflict.
Yeah, from actually declaring war, legitimately that whole Roman concept of a just war.
Right, through to the sanctity of messengers and the ultimate fate of the conquered. It's a fascinating look at the very beginnings of international conduct, and it seems like it was fueled more by, piety than actual pacts.
I think that's a really important distinction to grasp right at the start. For the Greeks, violating a custom might be a transgression against Panhellenic honor, but for the Romans, a military action lacking the proper religious steps wasn't just a political mistake.
It was more serious.
Oh, much more. It was seen as a violation of the Iconis Divinum, the sacred law. It risked incurring the wrath of the gods, potentially undermining the whole campaign. That religious scrupulosity, that anxiety about divine approval, it provided a far more fundamental basis for legitimacy than any political agreement could.
Okay, let's start then where that shared cultural identity really did seem to impose limits, at least sometimes. Let's start in Greece, specifically with the institution of the sacred truce.
Right. The Olympian festival. You could argue it was the most powerful, unifying Panhellenic institution the Greeks had.
Every 4 years, right?
Every 4 years. And it brought together athletes, merchants, spectators, not just from mainland Greece, but, from colonies all over Sicily, Italy, Asia Minor. It fostered this really profound consciousness of fellowship, as the source puts it, among all these scattered Greek communities.
And the core of this event, this cultural and religious magnet, was the ekikaria, the sacred truce.
Exactly, the Ekikaria. During the festival period, all wars were supposed to stop, and the territory of Elis, where the games were held, that was deemed inviolable, sacred ground.
That seems like a very clear example.
Yeah.
A religiously enforced temporary halt to fighting that actually overrode immediate political squabbles.
It absolutely proves they had the framework, the concept, to pause hostilities for a higher cultural purpose. But, like any law or custom, the real test is, well, how does it hold up under pressure?
Okay. So when we look at something like the Persian Wars.
Exactly. Then we start to see how selectively this religious obedience could sometimes be applied.
Right, because that's where it gets tricky. If the truce was so sacred, how did the Greeks square the, let's call it the moral problem, of delaying aid to Leonidas at Thermopylae? The excuse given was the Olympic Games or the Carnean Festival.
Which were happening around the same time, yes.
But the Confederate fleet kept maneuvering around Artemisium at that very same time, didn't it? So was piety just negotiable when it suited them?
Well, it certainly looks that way sometimes. The religious obligations provided a, shall we say, highly convenient political or moral excuse for delay, especially for land armies like the Peloponnesians, who were maybe a bit hesitant to march north anyway.
But naval strategy was critical.
And suddenly the religious calendar seemed less binding, didn't it? So the truce defined the ideal, the principle. But political necessity, strategic interests, they often allowed for, let's say, significant, if perhaps quiet, negotiation around the rules of piety.
Okay, moving from those religious sort of temporary limits to the more enduring moral ones, we have to talk about the Greek obsession, really, with courage and honor, particularly for Athens and Sparta.
Yeah, for the Greeks, citizenship wasn't just about where you were born. It was inextricably linked to your conduct in battle.
The core principle being Andrea.
Andrea, which we translate as manliness, but it fundamentally means courage, the refusal to give in to fear. And this wasn't just, a nice quality to have. It was the absolute foundation of the citizen soldier's contract with the polis, with the city-state.
And they baked this right into the start of adult life, didn't they, with the ephebic oath?
Yes, young men preparing for service swore this oath. And what's fascinating is that it doesn't really dwell on victory or glory. It's about preventing shame.
I will not bring shame on my sacred arms, nor will I abandon the man beside me, wherever I may stand in line.
Exactly. The priority is defensive in a moral sense. Shunning shameful behavior, maintaining the integrity of the phalanx line, protecting your buddy.
And if you failed in that core duty, if you showed cowardice or deserted,
The consequences weren't just, social awkwardness. They were intensely legal. Prosecution followed, and potentially the most devastating penalty, atimia.
loss of citizen rights. But let's clarify for the listener what atimia really meant practically. It sounds quite severe.
Oh, it was catastrophic. It wasn't just losing your right to vote. The person suffering atimia lost their ability to participate in any public life. They couldn't sue in court, couldn't hold religious office, couldn't even enter sacred precincts. They essentially became an outcast, a non-person legally.
Unable to protect their family, their property.
Or their honor. It completely stripped them. And this severity, it really underscores why certain acts of cowardice were so universally condemned, particularly abandoning your shield, the hoplon.
Right, the shield was key. You could lose your spear, maybe your helmet, and keep fighting or retreat in reasonable order, but dropping the shield.
That meant you had consciously chosen your own escape over protecting the man next to you. In the phalanx, your shield protected the left side of the man to your right. Dropping it endangered the entire line. It was the ultimate betrayal of that social contract.
And yet, because this value placed on honor was so incredibly high, a defeat, if achieved honorably, could actually be valued more than a sort of grubby strategic victory.
Thermopylae. It's the absolute defining example, isn't it?
A technical military defeat, obviously. They were wiped out.
Yes, but it immediately became the single most formative story in the Spartan myth, a great moral victory. That willingness to die for the standard, to hold the line even when the battle was clearly lost. It placed this supreme value on morale, on honor, way above mere strategic success.
And that kind of moral resolve, it extended even into high-stakes diplomacy, didn't it? Like the Mardonius exchange during the Persian Wars. That wasn't just military talk. It felt like moral warfare.
Precisely. You have Athens devastated by Xerxes. The city is in ruins, the people scattered, resources gone. And Xerxes' general, Mardonius, comes along with this incredibly generous offer of alliance. Pragmatically.
Pragmatically, they should have taken it. Secure survival.
Maybe. But the Athenian reply, which became, a cornerstone of their history,
Right.
it was one of absolute solemn refusal. They told Mardonius's envoy, essentially, as long as the sun keeps rising and setting, we will never make an alliance with Xerxes.
And the reason they gave is crucial.
It's the key. It wasn't just strategic pride or, stubbornness. The refusal was rooted, yes, in defending their freedom, but even more powerfully in honoring the gods and heroes whose temples and statues Xerxes had burned.
They were betting on the gods Xerxes had insulted.
Exactly. Putting their trust in the aid of the very deities Xerxes had shown zero reverence for. It's an incredible display of moral resolve, especially when they were technically losing the war. Prioritizing piety and the long-term ideal of freedom over immediate survival.
Now, shifting forward a bit, we see a different kind of moral restraint, maybe more complex, with Alexander the Great. Still rooted in conquest, obviously, but acknowledging a certain custom of respect for royalty.
Yes, when Alexander finally finds Darius III, the Persian king, dying, assassinated by his own men.
What did Alexander do?
The story goes, famously, that he threw his own cloak over Darius's body. It's a moment crafted for history, certainly.
Performing the role of the honorable victor.
Performing the role, yes, but also fulfilling a kind of requirement for generous treatment of a conquered rival. Even after years of brutal warfare leading up to that point, it adheres to that ancient sort of unwritten rule that even in death, a king retains a certain status.
Giving Darius a moment of dignity. I think the sources mentioned he got a drink of water and his family had been treated well previously.
That's right. His mother and wife were treated respectfully. So this final act, covering the body, it frames Alexander not just as a conqueror, but as the legitimate, honorable successor to the Achaemenid throne. A ruler who understands the customs, even towards a defeated great king.
Okay, let's transition now. We've talked about Greek honor and piety on the battlefield. Let's look deeper at the institutional side. The role of law itself in managing violence, not just externally, but crucially within the city walls.
And this is one of the most fundamental shifts in the ancient world, I think. moving from violent, controlled by personal vengeance, the blood feud, the obligations of family ties.
The
Right, the
oikos.
oikos. Moving from that to placing control squarely in the hands of the state, the polis.
And in Athens, the big moment for this is Draco's Code, around 621 BC.
Draco, famous for harsh laws, maybe apocryphally so in some cases, but his legislation on homicide specifically seems to have been genuinely groundbreaking and, importantly, successful over time.
How so? What did it change?
It effectively broke the cycle where the oikos, the family or household, was the sole agent responsible for seeking justice, or rather vengeance, for a killing. Draco's law, whether immediately or gradually, moved towards ending retaliatory blood killing by putting the judgment, the process, the right to avenge a death under state control.
The state manages vengeance now.
Which is an absolutely essential step towards creating a cohesive society. It stops powerful families from engaging in potentially endless, destabilizing blood feuds.
And this whole conceptual shift, from the oikos' obligations to the polis's rule of law, it's not just some dry legal history. It's a central cultural drama of the time, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And we see it reflected perfectly in literature. The prime example is Aeschylus's Oresteia.
Right, the trilogy about Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, Orestes.
Exactly. It's a cycle of matricide, revenge, all driven by those intense family blood ties, the demands of the oikos. But how is the cycle finally broken?
Not by another killing.
No, it's resolved by the establishment of a court, the court of the Areopagus in Athens. The goddess Athena herself persuades the Furies, these ancient spirits of vengeance, to accept a new role within the established legal order of the polis.
So the play itself is almost like propaganda for the legal system.
You could see it that way. It's a piece of state legitimation, absolutely. It shows the Athenians celebrating the idea that the state must adjudicate violence, replacing that personal, divinely sanctioned vengeance with human law, with process.
It's the city taking ownership of the ultimate penalty, death.
Hmm.
And that institutional stability, that's the bedrock you need before you can even start thinking about a legal framework for how the polis deals with other states, right?
Which brings us nicely to Rome. Their foundation for a legitimate conflict, it wasn't so much about cultural honor in the Greek sense, but about this intense, almost obsessive religious prerequisite.
Roman legitimacy and religio.
Religio.
Right.
Which isn't quite religion as we think of it. It's more like an anxious scrupulosity, a deep concern about doing things correctly according to divine will. The fundamental idea was, you do nothing of state significance, and declaring war is about as significant as it gets until the will of the gods is absolutely clear and you've done the rituals correctly.
And this is where the Fetial priests come in. Our source mentions the religious imperative, but these were the guys, right?
Yes, the Fetials. A specific college of priests responsible for these crucial rites. They handled demanding restitution from enemies, formally declaring war, consecrating treaties. Their role was essential.
To ensure the war was a idius bellum, a just war.
Exactly. A just war, in the Roman sense, meant religiously sanctioned. The Fetial priest would go to the enemy's border, perform the rituals, and ritually hurl a spear into their territory. That was the formal declaration.
And skipping this wasn't just bad form.
Oh, no. It was potentially disastrous. If the proper religious steps weren't followed, the war was considered illegitimate. It could attract divine disapproval, which, in turn, could completely undermine the morale of the legions. This idius divinum, the divine law aspect, was the absolute foundation for whether Rome considered a conflict legitimate in the eyes of the gods.
And we see this belief everywhere in their military practice, don't we? Armies entering foreign territory needing special religious measures.
Constantly reading phrases like disfaventibus with the gods' favor. For Rome, victory wasn't just about strategy and manpower. The gods had to be demonstrably on board.
And this sense of sacredness of state authority, it extended beyond the act of war itself to protecting the state's agents, didn't it? Particularly ambassadors and heralds.
Yes, their protection is one of the clearest, earliest norms of something resembling international relations. Their inviolability was crucial.
And where did that inviolability come from? Legally or religiously?
Probably a mix, but fundamentally from their status as agents acting for the state, the polis, or the Roman Republic on a public matter. We can sort of understand it by analogy within Roman domestic law.
How so?
Well, think about a magistrate acting under public law, administering justice. They were legally shielded from certain prosecutions, like an action for insult or contumely when acting within their official capacity.
Okay, so if a judge is protected while doing his job.
Right. Then a herald or an ambassador who is conducting absolutely critical public business, carrying terms of war or peace, Their inviolability likely derived from that same principle. They are necessary agents of the state acting in an official public capacity.
And reinforced by religious customs too, perhaps. Vows for safe passage.
Certainly, and by sheer necessity. I mean, it's an unspoken rule of diplomacy even today, isn't it? If you harm the messenger, you shut down communication, then the only option left is usually total conflict. The very existence of this strong protection for heralds and ambassadors shows these early efforts to create shared principles that could, at least sometimes, limit the absolute scope of violence.
Okay, so we have these ideals: honor, piety, diplomatic immunity. But when we look at the actual execution of law, especially punishments, the reality seems much harsher and deeply divided by social status. This brings us to that stark dual penalty system in Rome.
Yes, Roman law was incredibly status conscious. It wasn't subtle about it. You had a clear division between the high status individuals, the honestiors, the honored ones.
The elite.
Basically, yes.
Mhm.
And then the lower status individuals, the humiliors or non-citizens. And when it came to capital crimes, your status determined almost everything, including how you might be punished or if you'd be executed at all.
So give us an example. The decurions, high stat.
Right. Decurions, local magistrates, high status, they were generally exempt from capital punishment. The big exception usually cited is parricide, killing your own parent, which was seen as uniquely heinous. But for most other capital offenses, instead of execution, they faced things like deportation, being exiled to a specific place, or relegation, a lesser form of exile, or maybe punishment under a specific law like the Lex Cornelia, which might involve loss of status or property.
So social death, political exclusion, geographical removal, but generally not physical execution or torture.
Exactly. Compare that to the humiliors. The penalties reserved for them were often brutal and designed to inflict physical pain and public humiliation, being loaded with chains, public flogging, scourging.
And the worst, non-lethal sentence: condemnation to the mines.
Ad metallum. Condemnation to the mines. This was horrific. The person condemned became a servus ponae, literally a slave of the penalty. They lost their citizenship, if they had it, lost their liberty entirely. It was a living death sentence, often short and brutal. The state felt it necessary to police the poor and non-citizens with intense physical repression.
We see a similar, though maybe inverted, logic based on status in Plato's laws when he discusses temple robbery. The crime is the same sacrilege, but the proposed punishment depends entirely on who did it.
Right. If the temple robber was a slave or a foreigner, Plato's ideal law suggested branding, scourging, and then casting them out naked beyond the borders. The aim there seems to be punishment, repression, maybe a harsh form of exile, deterrence for others like them.
But if the temple robber was a citizen?
Then it's a whole different story. If a citizen committed this sacrilege, Plato deems them incurable. Death is the only fitting penalty.
Why the difference? Why is the citizen incurable?
It speaks volumes about the expectations the polis placed on its citizens. A citizen's failure wasn't just a crime against property or the gods. It was seen as a fundamental moral corruption of the political system itself. They had betrayed their elevated status, the trust invested in them by the state. That betrayal necessitated a far more severe final penalty. Citizenship came with higher stakes, higher consequences.
And this hierarchy, this focus on status and state priority, it becomes even more intense in the military sphere, doesn't it? Military law versus civilian law.
Oh, absolutely magnified. Military law was often ruthlessly severe compared to civilian rules. Certain offenses that might get a civilian a fine or maybe no penalty at all could result in capital punishment for a soldier.
Because the soldier was seen as an instrument of the state.
Precisely. An absolute public instrument. Any behavior that undermined the effectiveness, discipline, or even the perceived integrity of that instrument was treated as an existential threat to the state itself.
And the examples are quite striking, almost bizarre to us. If a soldier participated in stage plays,
Capital punishment.
or allowed himself to be sold into slavery.
Capital punishment.
Why the extreme penalty for something like acting in a play? It seems trivial.
From the state's perspective, it wasn't trivial. Participating in plays was seen as frivolous, potentially leading to softness, distraction from duty, and allowing oneself to be sold into slavery. That was the ultimate failure of personal honor, discipline, and loyalty to the state that relied on you. The military code enforced discipline with such severity because compromising the army, the state's primary defense mechanism, was unthinkable. These trivial acts became capital offenses in that context.
Of course, all of this relies on the legal institutions actually functioning according to some process. Which brings us to the period of the 30 tyrants in Athens. A terrifying example of what happens when law itself is twisted for political ends.
Exactly. The reign of the 30 tyrants, short though it was, serves as this stark reminder that established legal procedure, even the often messy democratic practice Athens had existed as a recognized standard. And the 30's blatant violation of that standard was perceived by Athenians as the ultimate injustice, the ultimate tyranny.
How do they violate it?
They essentially bypassed the entire system. They acted simultaneously as prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner. They condemned citizens without any due process, a concept the Greeks called akritis apekteinin, killing without trial.
And the scale of it was staggering.
It was pure political terror designed to eliminate opposition and consolidate power. They executed, according to the sources, 300 Athenian citizens who had been arrested in Salamis and Eleusis. And how were they condemned? All condemned to death on a single vote, just one vote for the whole group. That action, regardless of any individual's potential guilt or innocence, wasn't about justice. It was about stripping away the very idea of due process, demonstrating the tyrant's absolute, unchecked power over life and death. They weren't just killing people, they were destroying the foundational principle of the polis, that violence must be adjudicated by the system, not by arbitrary decree.
So when those systems fail, or when war simply reaches its brutal conclusion, the outcome for the defeated could be absolute. Enslavement, destruction, often the accepted norms based on the right of conquest.
Absolutely. This was often just routine practice, driven by military logic and economic reality. We see Rome doing this after the siege of Sommet. It was a long, hard siege, 4 months. When the city finally fell, what happened?
Enslaved.
The entire surviving population was sold into slavery. That was the standard operating procedure, the expected legal and economic outcome of losing a siege like that.
But the most extreme fate proposed for a defeated state comes at the end of the Peloponnesian War, doesn't it? The proposal against Athens itself.
Yes. Athens' rivals, particularly Corinth and Thebes, argued for the complete and utter destruction of Athens. Not just defeat, but annihilation. Level the city, tear down the walls, sell every single Athenian man, woman, and child into slavery.
That reflects the harshest interpretation of the right of conquest, doesn't it? The victor owns everything, including the people.
Entirely. And for Athens' rivals, it was seen as, well, politically necessary. A chance to permanently eliminate a major commercial and political competitor. Barbarous, perhaps, but legally within the rights of the victor at the time.
But then we get that extraordinary moment. Sparta, the actual victor, steps in.
And Sparta rejects this barbarous proposal. They vetoed it.
Why? What was Sparta's reasoning?
Well, the sources suggest a couple of things. Firstly, Sparta didn't quite have the same deep-seated commercial jealousy of Athens that Corinth and Thebes did. But more profoundly, and more relevant to our discussion, Sparta reportedly chose to spare the city specifically because of its past noble services to Greece against the Persian invader.
Wow. So historical memory trumped immediate political gain.
It appears so. This is a really critical moment. It shows that historical custom, the shared memory of collective action against a common existential enemy from the past, could actually supersede the strict legal and political right of total conquest. Sparta was willing to forego huge potential economic gain and the satisfaction of utterly crushing their rival, apparently out of respect for Athens' role in saving Greece decades earlier.
It demonstrates that moral and historical precedent could sometimes impose real limits, even on the supposedly absolute right of the victor.
It could. But we shouldn't overstate it. The vast majority of people captured in ancient wars didn't benefit from the historical prestige of a city like Athens. They entered the system as property, as slaves. Which brings us to the complexities of prisoner status and the idea of conditional freedom, especially under Roman law.
Right. Slavery, whether through war, debt, or birth, was a very defined legal status. But was it always permanent? Were there ways out?
There were structured avenues, yes, but often involving conditional manumission, not immediate, outright freedom. And these avenues were usually incredibly difficult.
How so? What did it typically involve?
Often it required the slave themselves to somehow save up or have someone provide on their behalf a substantial sum of money. The source mentions 400 drachmae as a common figure paid to the master or mistress in exchange for eventual freedom.
400 drachmae. Put that in perspective for us. How much money was that, really?
It was a huge amount. For context, it might be enough to feed a poor peasant family for, say, 3 years or more, or maybe the equivalent of a highly skilled artisan's income for a full year, perhaps. For someone who is legally property with limited or no means to earn and keep money independently, Saving that sum was an astronomical, almost impossible task.
So they're effectively paying an enormous price,
Mm.
maybe over many years, buying their own life back in installments.
Yeah.
But even after they managed to pay this fortune, was the freedom immediate? Did they just walk away?
Very rarely, that's the catch. This conditional release often obliged the person they weren't fully free yet to remain in what the source calls a slave-like condition. Meaning they usually had to continue serving their former master or mistress until that person died. They were still living in the household, doing the daily work, subject to punishment, liable for service, just like a slave. The difference was they had paid for the legal prospect of freedom at some point in the future upon their owner's death.
That system. Paying a fortune just for the illusion of freedom, deferred until an unknown future date. It really highlights the fundamental economic cruelty baked into the ancient legal world, doesn't it? Even when it seems to be offering a path out.
It absolutely does. It shows the immense tension between any ideals of honor or potential mercy and the crushing reality of legal status and economic exploitation.
Which seems like a good place to start summarizing.
I
When we look back at this whole picture, these rules, customs, taboos, what's the big takeaway? It seems these ancient systems relied on a really volatile mix, didn't they?
I think that's right. A volatile mix of religious imperatives, fear of the gods, concepts of military honor, that Andrea, alongside these nascent codified laws.
But enforcement often depended far more on the character or maybe the political calculations of the victor, like Sparta sparing Athens, than on any kind of universal enforceable treaty.
So not quite international law as we know it. Not yet. But they absolutely represent the earliest evidence we have of societies attempting to imagine something like an international community, one governed by shared principles, however rudimentary or inconsistently applied. The observance of truces, the protection of heralds, the distinctions in punishment based on citizenship, even those rare acts of mercy.
They're the ancestors.
They are indeed the distant ancestors of the modern Geneva Conventions and the body of international humanitarian law we try, often imperfectly, to uphold today. They show that even in ages we perceive as defined by total war, humanity was already searching for ways to establish limits, to impose some kind of order on the chaos.
Okay, that brings us to our final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on. We talked about Draco's law on homicide, how the state had to essentially wrest control of violence away from the personal family feud, the oikos, and bring it into the court system, the police.
Right, institutionalizing it.
So, does the very existence of these laws of war, both ancient and modern, suggest that maybe armed conflict is still fundamentally just a feud writ large, a form of violence that the state has tried over millennia, but maybe perpetually failed, to fully tame and incorporate into a system of justice?
Or perhaps looking at it another way, do those ancient concepts, the ones rooted in honor, in piety, driven by a cultural sense of shame and a genuine fear of divine retribution, do they offer a type of moral restraint, however flawed, that our modern, more secular international laws still struggle to replicate effectively?
A tough question. Does true restraint come from codified law or from something deeper, more cultural, more spiritual perhaps?
It's a fundamental question about how much control we truly believe the state or international agreements can ever have over the violence sanctioned in its name.
Something to definitely ponder as you reflect on this ancient world and its echoes today. Thanks for diving in with us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.